My name is Joe. I come from Faculty of Arts, the University of Auckland. Today, I am very happy to have this opportunity to share with you one of my research currently under review. It's titled Theorizing and Educating Professional Translation Ethical Competence. Sometimes the professional translation ethical competence in this presentation is abbreviated as PTEC. You're going to come across a lot of PTECs down this presentation. And the subtitle is a neurocognitive ethical decision-making perspective. So basically, I'm going to, in this presentation, propose a tentative education program for PTEC from the perspective of neurocognitive ethical decision-making. So if you look at the world today, the triosphere, which was a concept proposed by Michael Cronin to refer to the totality of the world, composed of both the translation between the living organisms and that between the living and non-living organisms. The triosphere today is changing very, very rapidly. And the driving factors of such changes include globalization, which has driven up the global cross-cultural communication needs, the surging immigration ever since the latter half of the 20th century, geopolitical wars and conflicts, the neck-breaking technological advancement, the climate change, which is now affecting everyone, and the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. So to address those problems needs communication, especially cross-cultural communication. And professional translators today are present in all those scenarios to seek responses to those challenges. So in the pictures, you see the war and the conflict scenarios, the joint responses against climate change and others. Especially today, the professional translators are working with increasing technologies, which has been changing the very nature of the translatorial action and bringing a lot of new moral problems for the professional translators. In this new and changing context, our professional translator education needs to prepare ethically our future translators for the changing market and the profession. In the new century, two notable changes have taken place in the professional translator ethics education. One is that previously, ethics has been a theme hovering in the background of translator education. But since the beginning of this century, especially when you look at the ITT's special issue published in 2011, you see that many universities around the world have been designing programs for professional translation ethics that explicitly teaches translation ethics to students. The second change is that previously teachers tried to preach the translator codes of ethics to students to familiarize them with the different codes and standards. But now the new kernel of professional translation ethics education has shifted to training students' ethical decision-making competence in situ. One of the aims is to sensitize students to the moral challenges frequently happening in translation, the other being to improve students' reflexive judgment in situ. This research aims to advance or carry forward the professional translation ethics education centered around students' ethical decision-making competence. Specifically, we aim to answer the following three questions. First, what is professional translation ethical competence, or the PTEC? We're going to provide a competence definition of PTEC. And the second question is that, is there a theory, a framework that can illuminate the subcomponents of PTEC and therefore structure its education? So we're going to seek a competency framework of PTEC. And last but not least, we're going to propose a tentative program for educating PTEC centered around ethical decision-making competence of the students. So if you look at the interrelations between the three questions, you can see that if we want to answer the third one, we need to provide answers to the first two questions in the first place. To answer the first two questions, we looked at the research on ethical decision-making as a subject and have located the neurocognitive model of ethical decision-making as the cure. We first have a bit review of the ethical decision-making modeling. The modeling work of human ethical decision-making started in the late 1960s. Until today, there are three schools of such models: rationalist, which believe that ethical decision-making, or EDM, is a rational process; the intuitionist school, which believes that EDM is mostly an intuitive automatic process; and the dual system model, which combines the two. And the neurocognitive model of ethical decision-making proposed by Reynolds back in 2006 actually belongs to the third dual system model. So we'll first have a bit illustration of this model. If you look at the model, the present illustration here, in this model, it says that human EDM, or ethical decision-making, has two cycles. They all start from the searching and structuring of moral information in a moral environment. So the first cycle is the automatic, intuitive, reflexive cycle. That means when a person enters a moral environment, he first searches and patterns the moral stimuli, and then he tries to match the identified moral pattern with his stored ethical prototypes. The ethical prototypes are the multidimensional prototypes, which are descriptive and prescriptive, because those prototypes contains information about the certain moral situation, the moral problem, and the best possible action. That's the ethical action. So once the matching is successful, that will lead to automatic moral judgment and a subsequent moral action. But when this automatic moral judgment is questioned, in some cases by others, or the decision maker is dissatisfied with the final consequences, he introduces analytical reasoning to do post hoc rationalization on his automatic moral judgment. So that takes us to the second cycle. That's the rational cycle, which complements the reflexive cycle. It also starts from searching and structuring information in the moral environment. But this time, the decision maker actively reasons about those information and the moral problem, and then reaches a well-reasoned moral judgment, leading to a subsequent moral action. These two cycles are interactive in nature, and they somehow support each other. So with this neurocognitive model of ethical decision-making as a premise, we now can tentatively define PTEC, or professional translation ethical competence, that is the ethical decision-making competence in the professional translation context, as a dual construct that combines the professional translator's expertise in both intuitive and rational ethical decision-making. So, of course, these two cycles are interactive in nature. And leading from this definition, we can say, or we could conclude, or the competency framework of PTEC is that it has two components. One component is the competence in intuitive moral decision-making. The other is that in rational ethical decision-making. So speaking of the education of PTEC as a competence, then with this competency framework, we can say, if we want to educate students PTEC, we need to simultaneously educate their intuitive as well as rational ethical decision-making competencies. We first look at the first component, intuitive ethical decision-making as a competency. We first further divide the intuitive ethical decision-making competency according to Reynolds' model into three sub-competencies. They are the moral information structuring and patterning, that's to pattern the different moral stimuli information in the environment. Then the neural pattern matching, that's to match the identified moral patterns with the stored ethical prototypes. And then the post hoc rationalization, that's to introduce the rational cycle to get involved in, to reason about the intuitive judgment made. Leading from these subcompetencies of intuitive ethical decision-making, in the educational setting, we have established 4 targets accordingly. They are to train students' moral awareness to the information in the environment. First, Second, to provide adequate quality ethical prototypes to students. The quality ethical prototypes must be complete, accurate, and they're relevant. So the last two targets are to train students' ethical reasoning skills and to give them the opportunity to restructure their stored ethical prototypes. We have here found Hogarth's literature or his work on educating intuition much relevant for guiding the education of intuitive ethical decision-making competence. So Hogarth, in many instances, has proposed 7 principles on educating intuition. Well, based on their relevance, I have just had 5 principles here. You could see I have linked or connected different principles of Hogarth on educating intuition with the targets we have proposed in educating students' intuitive ethical decision-making competence. So we just briefly go over the principles. First, selecting or creating kind environments. Well, this kind environments is contrasted with the wicked environments by Hogarth. The kind environments are environments that are representative of the moral encounters and have very good quality feedback from experts or peers. The wicked environments are not representative of the moral encounters. The feedback is either missing or distorted. And then the second, seeking feedback. Of course, this is very important. Imposing circuit breakers. That means the decision maker need to be taught to reason about his intuitive judgment before sliding to intuitive or reflexive action. That's like imposing a circuit breaker on his intuitive mechanism. Then exploring information connections. That has 2 sides. The first side is to explore the morally relevant information in the environment. The other is to actively compare the moral environment or moral case at hand with the previously encountered moral cases by analogy. And the final one is making scientific methods intuitive. Through deliberate practicing, the decision maker can make well-reasoned judgment as a process into intuitive process. So these principles, they could be well connected with the targets. Based on such connections, we have conclusions here. So if we want to educate intuitive ethical decision-making as a holistic competency, we need to strive for the 4 targets, T1 to T4, and then we need to exercise those activities. For T1, we should train students moral awareness and case analogy as a capability. For T2, we need to create ethical situations or create or establish some opportunities for workplace apprenticeship for them to, with good feedback, for them to collect ethical prototypes. For T3 and T4, we should organize activities where they can impose circuit breakers on their intuitive ethical decision-making and exercise their rational reasoning skills. During this process, the originally stored ethical prototypes can be restructured or attuned to new moral situations. And the candidate pedagogical tools include group discussions, guided ethical case analysis, essay writing, etc. We're going to come across these activities in the final pieces of the slide. So I'll just talk about the next. So the second component is the rational ethical decision-making competency. For this competency, we also need to further divide this competency into sub-competencies. We choose to use James Rest, the American moral psychologist's 4-component model. According to the 4-component model, the human rational ethical decision-making process can be represented by 4 salient processes. First, moral sensitivity or awareness. That's a person interprets the moral dimensions of a social situation. Well, it could easily recall you to Reynolds' model that rational ethical decision-making also starts with identifying moral information. And the second component is moral judgment. That's the decision maker identifies among all available actions, the most ethical one. And moral motivation or intent, that the decision maker needs to prioritize ethical values then to over competing values like his personal interests, which may not be that ethical. And the final component is moral implementation. In this component, the decision maker carries out ethical actions despite likely difficulties. So these four salient components represent the most important process of rational ethical decision making. Of course, as you could tell, that the ethical decision making, rational ethical decision making, is more than this. But this model has been statistically proved as effective in representing this process. And this four-component model has actually very effectively guided professional ethics education programs. The most representative or exemplary program has been the University of Minnesota's Dentistry Ethics Education Program, which started in the 1980s. And over decades of practice and progress, the teachers or the staff at the University of Minnesota instructing this program has developed and validated a toolkit of instruments for teaching and assessing students' ethical competence under the four-component model. So you could see the teaching tools here and the assessment tools here. They're all well validated by many empirical studies. So we could use them as antecedents and adapt them for the purpose of educating professional translator trainees' rational ethical decision-making competence. Due to limited time, I'm not going to give a detailed review about the teaching tools and assessment tools here. We'll just jump directly to this table. This table is very important because it represents the kind of a crystallization of previous arguments, leading from the previous arguments. So this table represents the tentative program we have designed or proposed for educating PTEC, or again, professional translation ethical competence. If you look at the table, we divide this program into three stages according to the literature on professional development programs. So the first stage is pre-instruction, then instruction, and post-instruction. This makes it a complete program. Pre-instruction involves the translation teacher doing or conducting one-to-one interviews with the students enrolled in the program. The interviews will help determine the students' training needs, especially when the interviews find that students typically, in deficiency of a certain aspect of moral decision making. So it will involve the preparing of the interview protocols. And we just first look at the post-instruction. Post-instruction stage involves first trainee assessment, because you're going to assess, use the final assessment to measure students' progress. It will involve the different tools adapted to assess translation ethical competence as the final assessment, and then program evaluation. This will be a multi-stakeholder evaluation. Everyone, the students, the university staff, the professional translators, and even the ethicists involved in the program will be invited to give feedback and their evaluations about the program. This will be very helpful in refining the program as a continuous process. And the final one is the results reporting. Well, this is basically for the administrative purposes, because the university, the faculty, and even the managing board of the program, like a professional body of a translator association, will need the results for to aid their judgments or decision making. So we now put more time to the instruction stage. The components of instruction stage are designed with the specific activities. The activities are targeted at the competences of rational and intuitive ethical decision-making of the translation trainees. As you could see, I have listed the different targets here. The T1 to T4 represents the 4 targets of the intuitive ethical decision-making competence of professional translator trainees. And the C1 to C4 represents students' competencies in each of the components of the rational ethical decision-making competence according to the 4-component model. That's moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and moral implementation. So you could see that when I list the targets here, each of the activity targets one or more the specific main targets of the ethical decision-making competence. So the components, first, thematic lectures. This will be the lectures on the professional roles of the translators, because according to philosophical models on moral motivation, once the professionals have higher moral motivation, they're going to behave more ethically in their practice. So lectures on professional role of the translators is going to improve students' moral motivation. That's C3. Then the classroom teaching include introduction to ethical and translation ethical concepts and theories. This will be beneficial to T1, T3, C1, and 2. And then guided study of translator codes and standards. Again, T1, T3, C1, and C2. As you could see, these 2 lines of activities share the targets, because we believe that codes and standards, not limited, not confined to translation, could help the professional translators to identify the moral problems and help with their ethical judgment. And then the final activity is translators' professional role discussion. This is to complement the prior thematic lectures in improving students' moral motivation, so C3. Then the third component is supervised sessions. These sessions will be used as scenarios where the students can be guided in analyzing and interpreting or trying to find possible solutions to the typical representative ethical cases of professional translation. So here, students, by guided case analysis, they could train their T1, T2, T3, all the way to T4 and C1, C2. That's moral sensitivity and moral judgment or ethical judgment. Here, we need to pay some attention here, because in this process, especially when the activities involve the ethical judgment training, we would recommend that if conditions allow, the university staff or the university could actually invite or involve some ethicists into the program instruction, or as kind of a course advisors, because they have the ethical expertise needed to help comment on students' performance. So the last component of the instruction stage is interactive workshops. This will be for training the students' competency in actually implementing their ethical action, or to restructure the ethical prototypes, because when writing about the action, the imagined action plan of the ethical action, and actually playing the ethical action in the role-playing activities, they're going to have opportunities to compare their ethical prototypes with others and have the chance to restructure their ethical prototypes. So this table basically illustrates our proposed tentative program for tech education. With this program, we're going to have some opportunities as well as challenges. Opportunities mainly include, we're going to have a comprehensive theory-driven approach to translation ethics education centered around ethical decision-making. We're going to make translational ethical competences really accessible, because many of the tools we have adapted from the professional ethics education in dentistry are really quantifiable. And then it could make students' progress in ethics trackable. And also we could think about in the future about the possibility of adapting the program for translators continuing ethics education, which is now currently little researched. Of course, there are challenges. Mainly, we have to design the many tools, adapting the tools and materials like interview protocols, the ethical cases typical to the translation profession. We need to design them and validate them, which is going to take time. And then we need to improve our faculty's capability of instructing ethical programs. They have to be trained in both course instruction and ethics. They have to know about the ethics themselves before they could teach. And the challenge also goes with the reflexive program implementation. But sometimes, because sometimes we're just too easily to take for granted something we're actually testing. So keeping reflective about the program is really important. These are just some of the opportunities and challenges, and there are more to add. So last, there are some main references for you to check, for you to pursue in this subject. That's basically about my presentation. I welcome your questions.